So I'm John Bovay. I'm an assistant professor at the University. I'm John Bovay. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. I just moved to UConn 3 months ago, and brought a group of students here. Really happy that the folks who are organizing this invited me to come. I'm going to talk to you today about several research papers I've done on the economic effects of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So we'll get into it. I want to give this slide as a disclaimer. Some of this work is co-authored with folks who are employees of the Department of Agriculture, so this does not reflect the official view of the USDA or the IRI, which provided some of the data. So first I'm going to talk with you about the economics of food safety provision and regulation in general, and I'm going to talk with you about the Food Safety Modernization Act, and then I'll talk with you about the 3 different research papers I've done on the economics of FSMA. So an overview of the overall research agenda that I'm going to be talking about today. We know that the Food Safety Modernization Act, which has started to come on board just a few months ago and will be implemented gradually over a period of several years, is going to mandate costly practices for farms and other firms that produce food for sale in the U.S. So what I mean by economic effects is not what is the cost of the Food Safety Modernization Act going to be, but what are the distributional effects? Who's going to gain and who's going to lose from this costly rule or series of rules? Farms are differentiated in several ways, including by size, location, commodity, and whether they've already adopted private standards for food safety practices. I simulate the distributional effects, the ways in which producers gain and lose, and then also at the end of the presentation I'm going to get into the simulated effects of FSMA on food prices, and ultimately the goal is to talk about implications for consumer welfare. All I get to today is implications for food prices. So as a preview, overall my simulations indicate that cost shifts are going to imply only a small increase in farm gate and consumer prices. Larger farms are certainly going to benefit because they are able to take advantage of economies of scale, and also because they're more likely to have adopted good agricultural practices. Lastly, domestic farms are going to benefit relative to foreign farms. So food safety has been an issue that's raised considerable attention in the general media on occasion. You see headlines like this, you see headlines like this, people were arrested over food safety incidents. The best scientific evidence indicates that there are about 60 million cases of foodborne illness in a year, and in the US, and so this is what this big circle here indicates. Of those, about 80% are caused by unknown pathogens, which means that science doesn't even know the name of the bacteria or the vector that's making people sick. Only about 20% then is known pathogens, and of those, only a small share, about 0.1% of all cases of foodborne illness are confirmed by laboratory testing. So it's a big problem, affecting about 1 in 5 people. The reason that I bring up the discrepancy here between known pathogens and unknown pathogens is that it just goes to show you how difficult it is to ascertain that the food produced is going to be safe for consumption, is not going to make people sick. If we don't even know what's causing the illness, how can we go about improving the safety, reducing the risk of illness? And making laws that regulate how food is produced for the sake of improving safety is going to be difficult in achieving the aims because of that inherent uncertainty. A slide I made a few years ago showing some major outbreaks of foodborne illness in the US. The number of illnesses listed here is again just the number of laboratory confirmed cases. So you see a couple times a year at least there are more than 100 people getting sick from a particular contamination incident. And then the number of people who are actually sick from the same thing, but their sickness wasn't confirmed in the lab, that's going to be some huge multiple of this, maybe 20 times these numbers. So because people get sick from food producers have huge private incentives to work on food safety. If they're able to market in some way that the food is safe, buyers are going to be willing to pay more for the food. If you're not talking about marketing that this food is safer than our competitors, which you rarely see, private firms that produce food have an incentive to keep food safe, to reduce the risk of outbreak, which leads to recalls, which may lead to lawsuits, which may even lead to arrests. It can really jeopardize firms' reputations if they're associated with foodborne illness outbreaks. Jack in the Box is probably the most famous case. Back in the early 90s, this hamburger fast food chain made a lot of people sick out west, and it suffered hugely as a result of that. And then the last reason that private firms may want to improve their food safety is possibly to set precedent for pending regulation. So this is something that may have happened with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Private firms saying, hey, we're doing this, this is the standard. FDA looks toward that standard. This happens, I mean, you can look at the comments for the Food Safety Modernization Act and see that this did occur to some extent. I don't analyze it here in this paper, but it's there. So as a result of these private standards, you have seen over the years some firms binding together and collectively adopting food safety standards that closely resemble what is going to be a mandatory requirement under the Food Safety Modernization Act soon. So you can see the names here: the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, Good Agricultural Practices for Fresh Tomatoes. There was a federal marketing order for pistachios, which requires testing. And then in addition, probably more important than any of these supplier-driven standards is buyer requirements for food safety practices. So just a couple of visual aids. In 2006, there was a major outbreak of E. coli in spinach in California, and both before and since, firms have been marketing leafy greens with these tags like washed 3 times so you don't have to. Here's another one, pre-washed, and then right below that it says final rinse recommended. So these labels are something to think about. Are people reading these labels and saying, I'm going to go buy this product because it says it's been washed? Are they reading this label and saying, oh, washing doesn't matter? Again, this is private firm action. It has nothing to do with the Food Safety Modernization Act. And that's sort of a big theme of what I want to convey is that the Food Safety Modernization Act is going to impose costs, but it's not clear that it's going to improve the safety outcome of food products because the buyers are already requiring food safety standards. The firms are already adopting food safety standards. So to get into the details on the Food Safety Modernization Act, big picture, we need to recognize that the regulation of food safety in the U.S. is overseen by both the USDA and the FDA. There are some gray areas. This slide isn't 100% accurate. There's some products that you think might be meat, but they're regulated by FDA. But in general, USDA oversees the safety of meat, poultry, catfish, but not other fish, and then processed egg products. And FDA is responsible for overseeing the safety of everything else. What the Food Safety Modernization Act does is to expand the regulatory authority of FDA. FDA has, over the last 4 years, been writing rules that are going to be required practices for suppliers of the food categories that are regulated by FDA, as long as that food's going to be sold in the U.S. So if it's produced in Mexico, if it's produced in China, and it's intended for distribution in the U.S., it needs to be produced according to the Food Safety Modernization Act standards. FDA has done an economic analysis of the costs of compliance with the FSMA. For the produce safety rule, FDA says it's going to cost domestic farms about $370 million a year. And the produce safety rule is just one of the 5 or 6 major FSMA rules. Of this $370 million a year, nearly half of it is going to be for what I call passive personnel costs. These are things like paperwork, training workers that don't actually contribute directly to improving the safety of food. They're filling out a checklist to show that you have complied with the rules is not the same thing as complying with the things on that checklist. But it's going to be costly to keep records, to document that you're in compliance with the rule. So these are, in a sense, fixed costs. These are costs that everybody's going to have to incur, no matter how much food you have going through your processing facility or how much food you're harvesting from your farm. You're going to have to fill out checklists. You're going to have to train your workers. So that's one way that large farms and large manufacturers are going to be able to gain an advantage relative to smaller competitors. And this is something that FDA shows in their economic analysis. I talk more about the implications of these differential costs. So overall, FDA estimates that the total cost of compliance with all the Food Safety Modernization Act rules is going to be about $2 billion. And as I alluded to a couple times, the point of my work is to talk about the differential effects of complying with the Food Safety Modernization Act in terms of costs by size of firm and by location. So here are the major FSMA rules on the top. Produce safety rule has attracted a ton of attention, especially in this audience, of course. But there are also rules like the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls rules, once for human food, once for animal food. This is basically very similar to HACCP rules, but extending HACCP-like rules to other types of food processors. The Foreign Supplier Verification Program and the Third-Party Accreditation Rule go hand in hand. This means that importers of foreign food are going to have to document or obtain documentation that their suppliers are in compliance with the other FSMA rules, including the produce safety rule. So that's going to mean a relative cost advantage for domestic farms versus foreign farms. There are a couple of minor rules like the Sanitary transport rule, the intentional adulteration rule. Preventive controls rule for human food for large facilities has been in place since September, so 3 months. The produce safety rule is going to be phased in beginning in January for growers of sprouts, and the compliance is then going to be phased in like next January 2018 for large farms on down the line, with a few rules being phased in with a 2-year delay, so final compliance won't be until January 2022. So, as I said earlier, it's the producers and processors of FDA-regulated commodities are going to have to comply with FSMA. And there is a threshold so that the smallest firms and farms won't be regulated at all by FSMA. For farms, which I focus on in these talks, in these papers that I'm presenting today, the threshold is $25,000 a year. The produce safety rule applies to things that we generally think of as fresh produce, so fruits and vegetables, mushrooms, and a few other things. It excludes grains like wheat and oats, potatoes, and other vegetables that are very rarely consumed raw. And it also doesn't apply to produce that's going to undergo a kill step. Most of you probably know that if peaches are going to be canned, there's a process that kills the bacteria, and also that peaches, tomatoes, and other things that are grown, that are going to be canned are grown, there's specific breeds that are grown for canning. And so farmers are able to know well in advance whether this is going to be sold fresh or processed. In addition to the $25,000 threshold, so if farms don't sell $25,000 worth of produce, they will not have to comply with the produce safety rule. There's also a partial exemption, which they call a qualify exemption, farms will qualify for the exemption if they have less than $500,000 in annual sales of food. That's all food. So if they have a small vegetable operation but a large operation growing beef or dairy or something else, they're going to have to comply with the produce safety rule. But it's less than $500,000 in sales of food, and more than half of those sales have to be within a certain radius, 275-mile radius, or within the same state, and directly to consumers, retailers, or restaurants. This rule was crafted, this exemption was crafted to try to exempt people who do a lot of sales at farmers markets and at roadside stands, but they didn't want to put that language in, so they came up with this rule instead. This is basically an exemption from the produce safety rule. Farms have to label the produce with the name and address of the farm visible at the point of sale, but that's it. And then the exemption may be revoked if an outbreak is detected or if FDA thinks there's a problem. So here's an illustration of what this qualified exemption criteria is. You can see I highlighted Davis, California, where I went to grad school. If a farm is located in Davis, it could sell produce anywhere within this radius and anywhere within the state of California. So if they're selling more than half their produce within that highlighted area and they have less than $500,000 in sales of food, then they'll be able to declare themselves exempt. Similarly, over here on the east, if a farm is located in Ithaca, New York, they could make their sales in DC, New York City, and they would be fine. So getting into more of the details of the requirements of the produce safety rule, these are really things that I would characterize as sensible practices. I met with a bunch of growers in California last summer. All of them told me we're already doing everything that's required by the produce safety rule. The thing that we're worried about is what I've got listed here at the top, the agricultural water inspections. This basically has to meet drinking water level safety in terms of E. coli counts. That's the way I understand it. That's definitely a stricter standard than most growers have currently. Other than that, all the growers I talked to said, we're okay with FSMA, it's going to be more paperwork, but it's not going to affect the way that we run our farm operation. I'll take a sec to drink. So the other rules you can see listed here, there are special rules for handling handling compost, the way it can be applied to produce. There are health and hygiene measures, basically having hand washing stations and toilets accessible to farmers, farm workers. It's not quite clear how much of a difference that's going to make because OSHA already requires that toilets be within a quarter mile. Workers also have to undergo training so that they understand what the rule requires for all these things. They understand that they have to wash their hands. There are some other things. Sanitary standards for harvesting equipment is going to be a big one potentially. I won't go into the others here. So again, my research is about what the distributional effects of the Food Safety Modernization Act are going to be. Who's going to gain and who's going to lose from FSMA implementation. And then simulating the effect on food prices from the produce safety rule. I use as my source for the cost estimates the FDA's regulatory impact analysis. As I said, they estimate that the FSMA produce safety rule is going to cost about $370 million a year. We don't, there's a lot of criticism of the FDA's analysis, but it's the best I've got. It's a starting point. And it's a starting point because it's very coarse. There are farm level estimates for 3 different sizes of farms. A farm with $86,000 in sales, I forget the other numbers. I think it's $360,000 and then $1.5 million. They are line by line cost of compliance estimates, so that helps a little bit, but in terms of the distribution of costs by farm size, they don't have anything on sort of, I guess, you would think that the cost of compliance would vary based on whether the farm is using mechanical harvesters or hand harvesting technology. whether it's tree fruit or something that grows along the ground. But none of that is in the produce safety rules regulatory impact analysis, which the FDA did. So my analysis then relies on the assumption that farm costs differentiate in accordance with farm sales value or size. The FDA's regulatory impact analysis has nothing to say about baseline compliance, the extent to which farms are already adopting good agricultural practices. We don't say anything about that either. I've got colleagues from the USDA who have developed a survey. It's already been taken by a lot of farmers to see who's in compliance with the FSMA requirements already, but I don't have access to that yet. So that may be a future research project. I'm glad to see that the previous presenter used the word elasticity, so maybe that word is a little bit understandable outside of the economics profession, but the implicit assumption that demand is perfectly elastic means that FDA has assumed, I say implicitly, it's not because they were silly, but just to make things simpler, they assumed that no matter what the price is, quantity demanded is going to be the same, which is not exactly how we think things work as economists or as business people. Lastly, the FDA doesn't say anything about any demand shift in response to improved safety outcomes, and they don't model firms exiting from farming as a result of the FSMA. There's no notion that farms may abandon growing produce as a result of having to incur all these costs. This is a summary of the FDA's numbers. So the top two rows are qualified farms. These are the ones that qualify for the partial exemption. And so their average cost of compliance is about $1,700 a year, which can still be a pretty hefty chunk of revenue for these smallest farms. And then we go into various size categories, 25,000, 250,000, 500,000 and above. So these three categories are what FDA regulatory impact analysis. They estimate the costs for those three different sizes. And then I introduce more variation in terms of the analysis of the cost of compliance as a share of sales for the largest farms, the ones that really have importance from an economic perspective, the ones that are really growing the vast majority of the produce. So you can see for these smallest fully regulated farms, the cost of compliance is going to be nearly 7% of the value of sales, while for large farms with more than 500,000, it's less than 1%, and for the really big players, it's much smaller than that. So I use these numbers and then simulate changes in the market based on these shifts in costs. So now I'm finally getting into the research papers, and I'll go through the results quickly because I think I've got about, 15 minutes? Okay. So the first paper that I've pretty much completed is with Dan Sumner at UC Davis. And this is a case study of the North American fresh tomato trade, in which we simulate the effects of FSMA implementation on farm prices and revenues. We chose fresh tomatoes as a case study because it has several advantages in terms of the way that costs are going to be differentiated across farms in North America. Imported tomatoes account for a little bit more than half of sales, and nearly all of them come from Mexico and Canada. So this allows us to illustrate the effects of the foreign supplier verification program. There was an especially early adoption of good agricultural practices on a collective basis by growers in California and Florida. And then there's going to be well over 75% of tomato growing farms in the US are going to qualify for a partial or full exemption based on their size and patterns of sales. So FSMA compliance vary for these different groups of farms that have different good agricultural practices or will qualify for an exemption. We use a fairly common economic simulation technique called an equilibrium displacement model to simulate the market effects of the FSMA over a series of many years, 40 years in this case, because it allows me to simulate what happens when there's a foodborne illness outbreak. And so I compare a 40-year horizon in which FSMA is not implemented, and a 40-year horizon starting next year in which FSMA is implemented. And I vary the rate and severity of foodborne illness outbreaks in those two time series and show the market effects. An illustration may help. Just skip that slide. So this is simulation. This is how the simulation works if there are two groups of growers. On this slide, I've got 64 groups of farms. If I had infinite computing power, I could have tens of thousands of farms, but for tractability, I keep it to 64 groups. In this illustration, there are just two groups, though. This helps a lot with the visual illustration. So this is group 2. This is their supply curve in the absence of FSMA. This is their supply curve with FSMA. Supplier group 1, same thing. This is without FSMA. Costs shift up so that at each quantity, it's more expensive to produce the same quantity of tomatoes. So then we have an aggregate supply curve. And this is what market effects would look like if you had a supply curve shift and no demand shift. In my model, demand does shift in response to foodborne illness outbreaks. So because I assume that FSMA improves the foodborne illness situation, reduces foodborne illness outbreaks, the net effect is a positive demand shift. And so this is what's going on with the model from a graphical sense. I've got a lot of assumptions. I was told a couple years ago by a lawyer that when they bring in economists as expert witnesses, it's really helpful for the economists to elaborate all of the assumptions that went into their model. So I talked a few minutes ago about the FDA's assumptions. I've got a list of some of my assumptions here, but there are many more. A couple of big ones. I also do not model exit. That introduces additional complexity. It's a realistic assumption that some farms are going to stop growing fresh tomatoes, but I just decided not to include that additional level of complexity here. I've got another paper showing that buyers don't really care about good agricultural practices adoption. That may be a topic for discussion after I'm done with my talk, but based on that, I assume that the demand response is not in response to the implementation of FSMA itself, but in response to an improvement in the foodborne illness situation, a reduction in the frequency of foodborne illnesses. I have to make some assumptions about the size of farms in Mexico and Canada because the data on the size of farms there isn't as good as the US data. And then lastly, I assume that the probability of a food safety problem on any given farm is halved after they've adopted GAPS or FSMA. So this is what my demand responses to foodborne illness outbreaks look like. In about 1% of cases, you see reduction in demand, a reduction in expenditures on tomatoes, decreasing by about 50% or more. And say the median outbreak, conditional on there being an outbreak, is about a 15% demand reduction. So in my model, outbreaks happen at a rate of like once every 6 to 10 years, I think. I've forgotten the details, sorry. But then conditional on there being an outbreak happening, this is the magnitude of the demand response. And then over time, over the next year or so, demand returns to its initial level. So these might not be the most intuitive graphs, so I'm sorry about that. But in the first month, I assume that the negative demand shock is 100%. And then a month later, it's about 50% of the initial negative shock. After 6 months, it's down to a little over 10% of the initial negative shock. So finally getting to the results that I'm sure you find much more interesting than the assumptions. In this tomato case study, I'm showing that the price of wholesale fresh tomatoes is going to increase by about 0.6 to 2.4%, depending on some various assumptions that I didn't show you. I've got 3 major scenarios, and then they're constructed to show a larger, medium, and smaller response. The quantity demanded is going to remain about the same. The biggest quantity demand shift I see is about 0.25%. And then these are 95% confidence bounds, which reflect the major disruptions you might see in the event of foodborne illness outbreaks. And they are really large confidence bounds. Sorry that this is so small and hard to read. There wasn't a really good way to represent it. On the left-hand column, you can see this is a simulated results broken down by producer category. Regions within the U.S., United States total, Mexico, and Canada. I'm going to focus on U.S. versus Mexico and Canada. So in scenario A, you see U.S. growers increasing their revenue by about 15% and their market share by about 6%. And then Mexico and Canada are going to be big losers in scenario A, but they're going to come out about even in scenario C. Basically, the level of imports is going to be the same as in the non-FSMA scenario in scenario C. So U.S. growers lose a little bit of revenue and market share. That's just really exactly the same as in the non-FSMA scenario. Breaking it down within the U.S. by farm size, you see that the largest growers are going to benefit. They're going to gain revenue and market share from the adoption of FSMA. Medium and small growers, even the ones that qualify for exemption, are going to lose from the adoption of FSMA. And then this one is telling a similar story, but looking at regions within the U.S. and also Mexico. I've got very large growers on top, very small growers, and then I want to throw in this note that Mexico is going to have some farms that qualify for an exemption if they sell their food locally, direct to restaurants, maybe across the border in San Diego or something like that. So you see the very small Mexican growers, if they want to stay in the U.S. market, they're going to suffer big losses. They're going to lose, in the most conservative scenario, 24% of their revenue. And this is all, again, driven by the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, the additional costs that importers are going to have to incur if they want to continue to bring in tomatoes from Mexico. And then this slide speaks to the important effects of GAPS adoption, good agricultural practices. So GAPS adopters are going to gain in a big way, and GAPS non-adopters, the ones who have not yet adopted GAPS, and there still are a significant portion of growers who have adopted no sorts of standards for food safety, smaller growers primarily, they're going to be significant losers. So getting into the next paper, with a couple of co-authors, Peyton Ferrier at the USDA and Chen Jen at the University of Georgia, we simulate the costs of the produce safety rule across commodities. So you can see here, this is again based on the same methodology. It's strictly a function of farm size, but you can see that the cost as a share of revenue is going to be around 0.4% for these commodities like artichokes and broccoli that are primarily grown on big farms in hot regions. Fruit is going to be a little bit higher because orchards, I guess, tend to be a little bit smaller on average. And we've also got a few outlier crops that aren't grown in big commodities in the U.S. like mangoes. So we definitely recognize that mangoes and bananas are grown in small quantities in the U.S. and these may not reflect the real costs we can expect to see. We also use the same methodology to simulate the cost by state. So the largest farms, ones in Arizona, states like Florida and California are going to have small costs as a share of compliance. This all assumes that none of these farms have adopted good agricultural practices. Farms in the Northeast are going to have significantly higher costs, around 2 to 3%, and in most states closer to 3%. So there are caveats. There are caveats in all economics papers, but again, this is based on the assumption that farm sales affect costs. Farm sales value affects costs. It's the only thing that affects costs. Doesn't consider imports, and so including bananas and mangoes is somewhat problematic. We use the results from this paper as an input to a third paper, which is about the cost pass-through the simulated effects of the Food Safety Modernization Act on retail costs, retail prices. And so we have a simulation looking at 18 fruit and 21 vegetable commodities. We estimated demand system for these 39 commodities and used the same cost shift estimates as I did in the other two papers. And the preliminary estimates are that consumer prices are going to increase by about 0.7% for fruit and 0.1% for vegetables. And the farm revenue is going to decrease by about 1% in both cases. We are in the process of revising the simulation, so these numbers may not be quite right, but I'm pretty sure that they're in the ballpark. And Jim, you can cut me off anytime you need to, but the main point I want to emphasize from this study is that no consumer is going to notice an 0.1% increase in the price of vegetables. So if our numbers are anywhere near right, if it's even 1%, 10 times, if we're off by a factor of 10, the effect of FSMA on retail consumers is going to be quite minimal. We do some things differently from the paper that I presented earlier with Dan Sumner, focusing on the pass-through of farm cost to retail. And we also allow for substitution in both production and consumption. We don't consider anything about international trade. We also don't consider baseline adoption of gaps. That's the theme running through all the papers I presented today. So as a result, the cost estimates may be quite a bit overstated because so many large farms have adopted food safety standards already. The costs of implementing FSMA are likely to be quite a bit lower. This is here for the sake of completeness, but it's technical stuff. We use data from the IRI, which is, it used to be known as Information Resources, Inc. It's retail scanner data. And then we estimate a two-stage quadratic almost ideal demand system for these 39 fruit and vegetable commodities. And then we employ the same sort of simulation with shifting supply and demand curves to arrive at our estimates of the pass-through of costs to retail consumers. These are, again, more technical slides. So here again is our preliminary results on the pass-through of costs to retail by commodity. So down at the bottom you can see this is for fruit. The average farm cost for fruit is going to be about 2.8%. Now the revenue for fruit growers is going to be about 1%, as I said earlier, but this is the cost shift. The consumers are going to see about 24% of that 2.8% cost increase, and the farms are going to see about half of it. And then similarly for vegetables, we overall estimate that vegetables, the cost of growing vegetables is going to increase by about 1%. Consumers are going to see just a tiny fraction of that, and farms are going to see maybe about 0.4%, something like that, in terms of cost increases. So a summary of this paper with Payton and Chen, FSMA costs are substantial, but they're going to vary across commodities. From our demand system, we estimate that the effects in terms of consumers being able to substitute from a commodity that's suddenly more expensive as a result of FSMA to one that's remained about the same. For example, sweet corn is exempt from FSMA. So there's some speculation that farmers and consumers may shift to sweet corn and other commodities that aren't regulated by FSMA. But we find that because people generally don't respond to tiny price increases in a very drastic way, there's not going to be much substitution to different commodities. And then exemptions from FSMA really don't confer much competitive advantage other than just not having to incur additional cost. We do have some additional work to do on this paper. We need to revise the demand system and incorporate demand-side benefits from FSMA. We're also going to look at the timing of FSMA implementation by farm size. So that's all I've got. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Informative presentation, Dr. Bovay. Thank
you.
You so much. So we do have some time for a few questions. Questions from the audience? I have a question about your first study.
Yeah.
With specific regard to demand shock. You
Sure.
illustrated a graph where it shows the responsiveness where it returns back to the normal demand curve. Did your study take into account the intensity of, say, social media or media and the negativity of the campaign?
Yeah. Wow. That's a great question, Jim. This is just based on the sort of historically observed responses to foodborne illness outbreaks. So I've got colleagues from USDA who've done a lot of work on what the effect of social media is on response to foodborne illness outbreaks. Colleagues have estimated that the demand response to the major outbreak of E. coli in spinach 10 years ago was in this region about 2/3 for a very brief period, and then it recovered in the weeks subsequent. But this study did not actually estimate demand response to any individual outbreaks. It's just based on work that others have done. Thanks.
Another question? We do have a question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could just very briefly explain what the additional costs are. So using that small farm in Mexico, for example, what are the additional costs that it will incur that results in that 74% loss in revenue that it might see?
So a very small farm in the U.S. is going to incur about 7% increase in costs as a share of revenue. Assuming that revenue and costs are about the same, you could say it's a 7% increase in the overall costs. And because we estimate that the market price is only going to increase by about 1%, if you're operating sort of at the margins, if you're just barely profitable, and there's suddenly a 7% increase in your costs, but the market price increases by only 1%, then you're not going to be able to sell to the same markets as you were before. You're going to have to find the people who are willing to pay 7% extra, or you're going to have to consider exiting from the fresh tomato market. So I don't think it's really realistic to say. Now, let me and to follow up, you have focused on the small farm in Mexico. So the foreign supplier verification program is going to mean that they get an even lower price for that product. They're going to have a 7% cost increase, and then buyers are not going to be willing to pay the same amount as they were before. So you're going to see a big gap, and it's basically going to be an unwise business decision for these farms to continue to try to pursue sales in U.S. markets if they're already operating so close to zero profitability, and then FSMA comes in. They're going to have to consider growing other produce or not exporting to the U.S. anymore. And so this is really a weakness of my model, because I don't account for farms exiting from the fresh tomato industry or from the produce industry in general. If we did have exit, you wouldn't see 74% revenue losses, but you'd see thousands of the smallest farms exiting from the fresh produce market. The third paper I talk about does explicitly account for farms being willing to substitute from, say, tomatoes to sweet corn, from the commodity that's regulated to the one that's not. And so that's definitely a strength of the paper that we're still working on. And that's maybe why you see such low cost numbers there too, is because it's a better model. It's a better analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Bovay. Another round of applause for the doctor.
Thanks a lot.